All right, I think those are all the logistics, so let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, so who has heard of the concept of decision intelligence before? Thank you. Quite a few followers and fans of us, I guess. For context, this event is officially by Decision Intelligence Japan. So this is an everybody welcome group. We're trying to spread knowledge about the field of decision intelligence, about best practices, about the software category that is DI, or decision intelligence. But it is sponsored by my company, Kimata AI. So for those of you who haven't met me yet, my name is Evan. I'm the CRO at Kimata AI, and we're a new startup in this space. We're going to be sharing all of the secret sauce about how to do this today. So, take notes or download the slides afterwards. We'll be providing a link for that. Feel free to ask questions and try this at home. We highly recommend checking this out. As you'll see, I hope through this presentation, this is a new field that's going to be extremely impactful, both in our careers and our day-to-day lives. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right in. Rough agenda. Surprisingly, this kind of is on track so far. I figured we'd kick off around 7:15. So there will be 45 minutes of my presentation, and then we're going to do a workshop around 8 o'clock. We'll probably take a little break before we do that. That workshop will be kind of getting your hands dirty, actually working with the field of decision intelligence, and that's where having a computer will be helpful. If you don't have your own, again, make friends with somebody who has one, you can work together. After that, we'll do a Q&A, and we ideally would like to close up by around 9, because afterwards we have to do some cleanup, and we have to be finished here by 9. Okay, so how do you make decisions? What does it mean to make decisions, and what does that process actually look like? If you think about the image here, all of these sort of paths that are going off and ending somewhere, that's kind of the process of what decisioning looks like. You try to imagine what would happen if you take some action. What would the eventual outcome of that be? And you can imagine different scenarios for the different decisions that you might take. Sort of theoretically or philosophically speaking, this is what the decisioning process looks like. This is what we're doing when we're trying to make decisions. We're imagining different scenarios. Has anybody read this book, Sapiens? If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's a very dense, very deep read. But Yuval Noah Harari is a philosopher, you could say a historian as well. And he wrote this book several years ago about a brief history of humankind. In this book, he talks about a very interesting concept, the concept of the cognitive revolution. Has anybody heard of that before? The cognitive revolution. If you've studied philosophy, if you've studied history or anthropology, you've probably heard about this idea. But according to the archaeological record, it looks like in the last 100,000 years, humans made an incredible jump forward in the ability to, let's say, imagine new ideas. There are multiple different factors that could have driven this. We don't know exactly why it is, but all of a sudden in the archaeological record, we see humans doing very new and interesting and creative things. It seems like our cognitive development reached a point where we made this big jump forward. And one of the pivotal things that we were able to do is to use our imagination to think of different scenarios. Yuval Noah Harari dives into this in detail. He talks about how this probably came about or why it may have came about. It's a very interesting story that he talks about here. But the key thing is that humans learned the power of imagination and the power of simulation. The idea that you could imagine different scenarios, imagine how they might play out, and essentially imagine what's called counterfactuals, things that are not actually fact. So again, I highly recommend this book. Has anybody seen this image before? The Hohenstein-Stattel Lion Man figurine. Has anybody heard about this before? Jean-Paul, I admire your depth and breadth of education.
My sister is an archaeologist.
Ah, yes, having a sister who's an archaeologist would help. So this is a very interesting archaeological find. About 40,000 to 35,000 years ago, somewhere around there, somebody carved this figurine. What does it represent? It's right there in the name. It's called the Lion Man. Yeah. So, sorry, say it again.
The Lion Man.
Yeah, it's the Lion Man. Yeah. So it represents this conceptual carving of a man, a bipedal, human-like figure that's standing, but it has the head of a lion. This doesn't exist in the real world. This is a counterfactual. It's not something that actually exists. So around this time period, it indicates that humans were able to use their imagination to come up with these ideas that were not actually true. You could imagine a scenario that wasn't true, like a lion man. Now, this is really, really interesting, and a lot of thinkers have picked up on this pivotal point in human history where we achieved this cognitive revolution. The reason it's so interesting is because it allows us to do this exploration of different scenarios. And from that, it allows us to make plans. What happens if I take these seeds and plant them and water them continuously? Would I get crops that I could then harvest? That becomes the birth of agriculture. What happens if we get together and we try to drive the mammoth down this path and somebody hides behind that rock and spears them? Or what happens if we do this? That gives you the ability to strategically plan out a hunt. So the birth of advanced hunting, the birth of agriculture, the ability to plan for the future, to take actions that affect future outcomes, that's the whole concept of this cognitive revolution. We're going to circle back to the Lion Man a little bit later on, so please remember that. Another very interesting thinker, Genet Pearl, he wrote the Book of Why. This book also references the Lion Man as an example of causality. He calls this the science of cause and effect. So taking the idea of counterfactuals, things that don't actually exist, imagining different scenarios, that leads to the science of causality. If we do this action, it leads to this outcome. Now this very interesting book, and I highly recommend it. It also talks about the limitations of statistical correlation, how data isn't always enough. Sometimes we have to plan for causality models that encompass all sorts of different factors. But the core premise is understanding this ability to create counterfactual situations and plan, and then understand through simulation and different scenarios what actions you can take to affect your desired outcomes. How about Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow? Has anybody read this book? All right, that's a higher percentage, about a third of the audience. The core premise of Thinking Fast and Slow, it's a study about how we actually think. So this represents the sort of evolution from that initial cognitive revolution where humans are able to imagine different scenarios and plan for them, to evaluating how it is that we actually think. And it introduces the idea of these two ways of thinking. We essentially have System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 is often called the limbic system. It's like the dinosaur brain. It's the nervous system that reacts when somebody makes a loud noise or causes you to fight or flight, run away if you're in danger. It's the system that allows you to basically survive in a day-to-day basis, but it's also your intuition system. It's the system that gathers all the information that you encounter on a daily basis, everything since you were born, everything that you know inherently, intrinsically, and it's always slowly processing that and kind of bubbling up inspiration, ideas. We often refer to this as gut instinct, or just instinctual thinking. System 2 is our top-down prefrontal cortex, logical thinking, rational thinking, slowly considering everything, weighing out the different permutations, weighting different things that might happen, and then making decisions. Another really interesting thing that Kahneman talks about in this book is awareness of cognitive biases. So if we understand how we think, how it is that we can make decisions, it arms us to be better at making decisions. But this alone isn't really enough, because we still have all of these cognitive biases to overcome. Does anybody know what a cognitive bias is? And can you explain it?
So when you
Hold on, I'm going to bring the mic over.
nothing special, just when the decisions are based on something from your usually past, which is not literally true with your consumption.
When your decisions are based on your past and experiences, but not necessarily fact, it's your preconceived understanding of things.
Sometimes it's even not we experience, but in our psychology that we pay more attention to some things and pay not as much attention as needed to some other things. And for example, we are bad in understanding probabilities.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great example. All right, thank you.
Thanks, and thanks for answering so well when people on the spot like that. Does anybody know how many identified biases there are?
Like a foundry.
We hear often about 20 of them, but there are actually a lot. There are a lot of biases that interfere with our thinking. And in fact, our whole mental model of the world, how we map things out, how we make decisions, is influenced by these biases. So although we want to feel that we understand everything in the world and we're making good decisions, in fact, as Kahneman says here, sometimes our concept of the world, our sense that everything is okay, we rest on a secure foundation, that's only because we don't understand everything that's going on. So our, as he says here, our comforting conviction that the world makes sense rests on a secure foundation, our almost unlimited ability to ignore our ignorance. So we can only function if we kind of ignore what it is that we don't know. And why is that? Well, because it's terrifying if you think about all the risks involved in making a decision. And it stops people from making decisions a lot of the time. So awareness of how we think is very helpful. This can be helpful as well. I hope that on the big screen here you can see this, but this is the cognitive bias index. This is an attempt to map out all of the different biases that affect our thinking. There are 147 listed here, and there are a lot. There are too many for me to go through right now, but please take some time to absorb this, or you can look it up. This image is taken from Wikipedia, so it's readily available. The important thing here is knowing that our thinking is not as accurate as we would like it to be. When we undertake a decision, our planning, our imagination of the scenario is often very inaccurate because we have these biases that cloud our thinking and because we don't have enough information to make good decisions. So you can improve your decision making by employing a strategic decision framework. Some examples of that are things like decision model notation, or DMN. These allow you to make strategies for carefully structured decisions. Business process model notation, or BPMN, or strategic decision-making formats or frameworks like the OODA loop, PDCA cycle, rational decision-making model, or the Kepler-Trego decision analysis framework. These are all very helpful. They can help a lot when you're framing a decision, trying to understand everything that's involved in it. And then we come to data-driven decision making. Has everybody heard about and employed data-driven decision making in their day-to-day life? Data-driven decision making for the past few years has been the promise that big data will allow us to process all of the information that we're lacking in order to make good decisions. In order to understand all of the factors so that we can understand everything, all of the causal factors, all of the outcomes that will be affected by our actions when we make decisions. How effective is data-driven decision making? It's kind of awkward to answer because we've been putting a lot of hope and a lot of investment into data-driven decision making. The reality is, if we look at studies by Gartner and McKinsey, about 30% of organizations are employing data-driven decision-making well. In reality, it tends to be used to support decisions that were already made through intuition. So the great promise of data-driven decision-making is actually not really working. Part of the problem is because it just leads to data overload. This leads to decision fatigue. So having more data, understanding everything that might be affected by your decisions, that's not really that helpful. That just overloads our human cognition. It actually makes us worse at decision making because no individual human can process all of that data, understand all of the causal factors, and really use all the data to make better weighted decisions. It just leads to indecision, and indecision is extremely costly. So McKinsey says that indecision costs the average Fortune 500 company $250 million a year, or $680,000 every day per company, just for the Fortune 500. That's a huge, huge cost. So that's kind of inexcusable. But it's not just a business problem. This is actually a planet-wide problem. Does anybody know what this chart here represents? Might be a little hard to read. These are the SDG goals, the 17 goals that have been mapped out. As of 2023, we're about 15% on track towards these goals, and about half of the time has elapsed to reach these goals. So we're considerably behind on these. In fact, with only about 15% of the targets on track and many actually going in reverse. Instead of the goal of leaving no one behind, we risk leaving the SDG goals themselves behind. So why does this happen? Why is it that we aren't able to make progress even when decisions are clearly mapped out? Well, part of the problem is that we just don't know what actions to take. It's too much. The data becomes overwhelming. Our ability to process all of this and make good decisions becomes too much for the average person. That's just at the individual decision-making level. But where the problem gets really severe is when you're trying to do a organizational decision, a team decision, when you're trying to get stakeholder alignment, when you're trying to decide which actions would be most effective towards something like the SDG goals, towards something like managing climate change. It becomes extremely difficult. So, part of the problem, again, is the overwhelming amount of data. Part of the problem is the tools that we have right now. Current business intelligence tools that we're using are backwards looking. So when we talk about making data-driven decisions, we're talking about using spreadsheets, analytics platforms, dashboards, trying to distill all of that data down into something that we can understand and then maybe take action on. And that's very difficult if you're just looking at an Excel spreadsheet or if you're looking at a BI platform dashboard, because it doesn't tell you what to do. Those platforms don't tell you what actions would be most effective to take. But if we get it right, good decision making is essentially a superpower. Just stop for a minute and think about that. Imagine if every decision you made was correct. Imagine if you always made the right choice. And even more, imagine if you knew you were going to make the right choice, and so there was no risk. You wouldn't have to hesitate and think, is this the right thing to do? Imagine how much more effective you could be. All of the challenges that we face today, whether it's global warming, or choosing what to study, which school to go to, which career path to take, who to marry, which life partner is the right choice for us. Imagine if all of that data. So it solves that problem of data overload when we're approaching a problem. This category, this software category, this new field has so much potential that Gartner estimates it's going to be worth about $36 billion. Actually, recently they upped their estimate in line with some other estimates that is closer to $50 billion. And that's just for the software category. So it has a huge potential impact. Well, I'd like to take a moment to give credit to the creators of the concept of decision intelligence. First of all, Dr. Maureen Pratt. So in 2008, she published this book, Link. This was the first book to really talk about the concept of decision intelligence, to coin the phrase, to put it out there in the public realm. And it talked about how this action-outcome connection can help us make a better world. And I highly recommend that book. She followed it up just last year with the sequel, the Decision Intelligence Handbook. It talks about the framework that I'll be introducing tonight. This is where we've taken our methodology from. And we've partnered with Dr. Pratt and the OpenDI project, Open Decision Intelligence Project, which you can see at opndi.org, to create the standards around this framework and increase awareness about it. I also recommend James Taylor's work. He's written several books on the subject. Digital Decisioning is his most recent one, using decision management to deliver business impact from AI. This book is very good. It's very business process framework heavy though. So just maybe start with Dr. Pratt, read that one for a bit of a balanced perspective. And then when you're ready to really get your hands dirty and start building these decision intelligence models, Python is the way to go. The 3 books on the bottom They all talk about how you can actually build these models using Python. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides later. And I also recommend Cassie Kozyrkov's YouTube channel and her LinkedIn certification series. So Cassie Kozyrkov was previously the head decision scientist at Google. She was Google's head decision scientist for several years. She trained about 20,000 people at Google on decision intelligence. So the practices that we're going to be talking about in the coming slides. She left just a few months ago to launch her own startup. She's doing a consulting service, and the startup is in stealth mode, so we don't know exactly what she's going to be launching yet, but stay tuned. It'll probably be quite interesting. So between Dr. Pratt and Cassie Kozyrkov's YouTube videos, you can get a really good overview of exactly how to do decision intelligence hands-on. But essentially, this is what we're talking about. If you remember the Lion Man, the idea that you can imagine an action-outcome connection and model out different scenarios, simulate different hypothetical situations. This is what led to the human cognitive revolution, this great leap forward in our history. Well, now with the power of AI, specifically prescriptive AI, we can leverage this tool to make another leap forward. Now this is important. Prescriptive AI, decision intelligence, it's just a tool. We're not talking about decision automation. We're not talking about machines taking over, making the decisions for us. It's decision augmentation, having the AI help us with decisions. Specifically, simulate the different scenarios to augment human judgment, help us identify and remove biases. This reinforces critical thinking, allows us to process all of the data so we don't get overwhelmed by it. The AI does the data processing, understands the patterns, understands which actions will be most effective, and very importantly, it allows us to experiment without risk. The human cognitive revolution allowed us to imagine what would happen if I went up and punched that lion in the face. It would eat me, so I won't do that. Decision intelligence allows us to imagine what would happen if we hired 20 salespeople when we only have one customer service rep to process all the business they create. We would probably go bankrupt. So imagine different scenarios, model out what would happen, and then make informed, correct decisions. Essentially, this is like decision navigation. Decision makers need to know what decisions to make, what actions lead to their desired outcomes. And actually, we're all using a type of decision intelligence or prescriptive AI today. When you use Google Maps, Apple Maps, or your car navigation, you map out your desired outcome you might get from point A to point B. And the AI recommends the best route to take. That's a great start, but conditions can change. So as you go down that route, the data is updated, and if there's a car crash or if there's congestion or something like that, it updates and makes a new recommendation, it recommends new alternate paths that you can take. This is how prescriptive AI works to help you map out decisions and then recommend the most meaningful actions you can take. And here's a bit of a shout out to our platform, Qmauta AI. Lets you do it like this. You map out your desired outcome, set a KPI, a quantifiable metric that you can track, and the AI will map out the most meaningful actions and their causal chains, what will be most effective. And then as you go, as conditions change, as you go down that path, as the data updates, it will make recommendations on even better actions that you can take, depending on current conditions. Okay, so what does it look like when you're actually using prescriptive AI? when you're employing this human judgment plus AI, decision intelligence, what can you do with it? Well, here are a few stories. So here's a case study, an energy management example. You can see here, I've taken a lot of these examples from one of the books that was referenced there earlier. This one is the Prescriptive Analytics Prescribed with Python Definitive Prescriptive Analytics Python Guide, part of a trifecta series on analytics. Highly recommend it, especially if you're a Python developer. It's very interesting. But in this case, energy management use case, Prescriptive AI is managing the grid, the energy grid, by forecasting demand. So by leveraging sensor data from smart meters, that will be the energy meters within the home or within the power station or the overall grid, and then integrating it with weather forecasts and usage patterns, you can distribute the energy in the system. And you can save a great deal of energy and deploy it where it's best used. I actually use this in my house. A couple years ago, I built a smart house. So it's off-grid, or could be completely off-grid in theory because it's covered with solar panels, it has a lithium battery pack, and most of the time we don't need energy from the grid, we sell energy to the grid. Because it's just my wife and I, we generate excess energy, and so we're selling it most of the time. Today, I think we probably sold about $100 worth of energy because it was very sunny. Well, that's nice, but what happens if we get a few cloudy days? Well, then we have to store all the energy in the batteries. And so the system will load balance. It will stop selling the energy, it will start storing it for our own use. And then if cloudy days continue, if it's a typhoon or something like that, or sometimes during the winter, then we actually have to pull energy back from the grid. We have to purchase energy back. That doesn't happen so often, and if we got an electric vehicle that could charge back to the grid, we'd have a second backup battery, we wouldn't have to do it at all. But this is how that type of system works. Here's another example, retail inventory management. Imagine how many vending machines there are around Japan. Does anybody know approximately? Can you guess how many, do you know how many there are in all of Japan? What was it, 200,000? Millions? 20,000? It's, can I say you're pretty close? It's 5 million. That's the number of vending machines throughout all of Japan. Now imagine what happens when you overstock the machine and there isn't enough demand and the product spoils. Now we don't usually think about this, but actually soda and juice and coffee, all this stuff, it doesn't last forever. If they've overstocked the machines, they get a lot of product wastage. Same thing happens in convenience stores and supermarkets. Another thing that happens is that these vending machines have to be cooled in summer, and then they're often heated in winter, and the load balancing for that is very difficult to do. So there's a lot of energy wastage and a lot of product wastage. But if you combine sensor data in the machines to identify when products were close to their expiration date, notified people that they were overstocked, not to do that in the future, monitored demand levels, and monitored weather patterns, then you could save a great deal of energy and you could save a great deal of product wastage. So that contributes to environmental stability. Here's another example. Managing disease, especially chronic disease. If a patient has a chronic condition like hypertension, I'm not a physician, but my understanding is that this is a blood pressure issue, and I think it can lead to a heart attack and issues like that. Prescriptive AI can be used to analyze data from blood pressure monitors, compare it with their electronic records, and monitor the patient's activity. So if their heart rate is going up too much, if their Fitbit indicates the heart rate is too high, it can send them a warning. It can say you're getting too close to danger. It can also monitor or notify their physician so that their physician can adjust their medication. And this can help to provide a much more balanced treatment plan, help with planning for exercise regimens, and all of this, dietary changes and so on. So these are a few examples of how decision intelligence, prescriptive AI, can be used for real-world, day-to-day decisions. Another big industry or big category for this is logistics, supply, demand. If you think about all of the different moving pieces in a logistics system, you have to look at actual sales data, delivery times between distribution centers, what time should trucks be at this station and how many, at what point should ships or planes be arriving. That's essentially a just-in-time optimization example. And in this case, a global distribution company or logistics company was able to monitor all of that with sensors, using sensors in the trucks especially and the last mile delivery, and improve their overall logistical costs by 20% using prescriptive AI. So the AI would make recommendations about where to move, how many trucks at one time, things like that. Okay, now this is how you do it. So I referenced earlier the framework from Dr. Pratt's book, the Decision Intelligence Handbook. This is an example of a causal decision map, or CDM. You have your desired outcomes, you have the actions that you can take, essentially the levers that you can pull, the things that are within your control, and what they will affect, intermediate factors. And then you have external factors that might affect them, things like the weather or market changes or competitor movement. This framework can be applied to any decision, regardless of its complexity. So where you should go to school, who you should marry, who your life partner should be, what you should do on Project X, how to get stakeholder alignment. All of this can be mapped with this framework. And you can do it with pen and paper. You can do it through an analog process. It gets you clarity. It shows you what actions will be most meaningful, and it gets stakeholder alignment. So it's very much like a digital memo watching process. The next step, once you've mapped that out, is to combine it with human experience, human judgment. Talk to your stakeholders, and you can understand the effectiveness of the actions in the system based on their previous experience. So what you don't want to do is create a complete digital model of every potential action and every potential intermediate that it might affect. That complete decision digital twin would be way too complex because you can leverage human experience at many points. You don't have to run models on everything. So you can talk to your salespeople and ask them, how many units do you think we can sell? Their experience will tell you. You can talk to logistics, you can talk to HR, get everybody together and map out what actions are going to be most meaningful based on their previous experience. That tells you where you can connect data at meaningful points. You don't want to connect data everywhere, just at the meaningful points to assist with carrying that load or lifting that weight. It's also where you can apply your different strategic processes. So if you're using something like BPMN, strategic framework, this is where you would talk with your consultants, strategic thinkers, and map out those points. The next step is to connect data. Everything you can get, everything you can use, that's applicable for the model. So if it's something like, let's say, dynamic pricing of a product, you would want to connect your CRM data. If you're trying to manage a marketing campaign, you would connect your CDP or customer data platform data. Or if you're trying to do something like the retail product stocking management use case, you would connect IoT sensor data. How many products are in the machine? How many products are on the shelf? That data can be useful for building models. But you don't need everything. You don't need all of the organizational data. And sometimes you're not going to have data at all. So you have to start with observed or recorded data. It's just simply track. Sometimes that's as simple as like pen and paper, record what's going on in the organization. Track all of that. Then you can connect AI. So for any developers in the room or watching this later, this is where you start leveraging the power of Python. Whether it's Pandas, NumPy, Scikit, SciPy, TensorFlow, whichever library makes sense for that model, there are existing Python libraries that you can leverage to build these models. You can connect them into your CDM or causal decision map and model out the effect of those actions. Then get recommendations on which actions are most effective. This is essentially the secret sauce of how you build this. This moves us from the backwards-looking business intelligence tool space, where it's mostly what happened, descriptive analytics, through diagnostic analytics, which is pattern recognition and forecasting, to predictive analytics, and finally to the final goal, which is prescriptive analytics that powers prescriptive AI. Prescriptive analytics talks about not just what will happen based on the predictions, but what can we do to affect those outcomes? How can we get control over our actions to reach our desired outcomes? And this is a quick plug for our company. This is obviously taken from our sales deck. But this is the big difference here. So existing tools, they kind of look at the problem backwards. They're processing all the data, massive amounts of data, just to do pattern matching, pattern recognition. But they don't tell us what actions to take. So Kimaru AI, my company, as an example of a decision intelligence platform, or DIP, it's leveraging prescriptive AI. We begin with a decision. What is your desired outcome? And then through that action outcome mapping, combined with human judgment, we can build the prescriptive AI models that give us control over what we can do in future. And that removes indecision, and it gives us a faster TTD, that's time to decision. Allows us to be much more productive because it removes all the doubt around decisions and gets us close to that decision-making superpower. And as it says here, it moves us from passively observing to actively controlling future outcomes. That's the goal. What actions can we take that would actually be most effective? Okay, so this is the framework. This is how you can actually use it. Decide your desired outcomes, map out the intermediaries, decide what actions you can take, and then map out external factors that would affect them. It can be kind of hard to visualize how this might work. So let's look at a specific example. Let's say that you're a VC and you want to invest in a startup like Kimaru AI. If you know any VCs, please show them this slide and then tell them to invest in us. The outcome here is return on investment to the VC for investing in the startup. The minimum target of any VC would be a minimum 3x return. Those are kind of Japanese benchmarks, by the way. An American VC would say, I want 50 or 100x return. But globally, they're looking for about 5 to 10x return on the investment. So what are the things that the startup or the VC could do? What actions could they take to affect this outcome? Well, this maps out a small percentage of the things that you can do. It's things like making sure that you're tracking the key objectives of the company. Are you actually hitting your roadmaps? Are you delivering the product on time? Are you hiring people on time? Is the company making progress towards its target? And is it able to report on that? Now, external things that can affect that are everything from the total addressable market size to government legislation, maybe things like currency fluctuation or competitor movement. And the intermediaries are many. This is just a short sample of the things that would be affected. But let's map out an example path. So let's say that the startup gets really good at employing the lean startup methodology, the culture of experimentation and optimization that was famously developed here at Google and has been employed by many startups. If you read about the lean startup methodology by Eric Ries, it's a great book that talks about this process. So by developing an experimentation and optimization process, it makes you more adaptable. It allows you to iterate faster. It allows you to ship faster, get your product out there, and that contributes to the rocket ship level of growth that a VC looks for to get the ROI on their investment. So what's the difference between an intermediary and an action? This is the point in this model where everybody gets a little confused. That's kind of hard to understand. But you can think about it like this. It's like a series of dominoes. If you have just 2 dominoes, set up domino 1, set up domino 2, and push domino 2, it's going to affect domino 1. That is action outcome. But if you have 3 dominoes, push number 3, it hits number 2, that's action intermediary, as it looks like number 1, that's outcome. So basically, any action that you can take is an intermediary until you map out an action upstream from it that affects it. Or rather, think of it this way. Rocket ship level growth. Achieve that. Achieve that action, you get your desired outcome. But there's something upstream from that. There are actions you can take upstream from that in this causal chain. Be more adaptable. Iterate faster. That leads to rocket ship level growth. So that's domino, 3 hitting 2, hitting 1. And upstream from that, the most effective action you can take is to develop this process of experimentation. So focus on the actions that are meaningful, that you can control, that are going to affect a causal chain. Once you've mapped out those actions, it's a focusing exercise because it tells you this is what I can actually do to achieve my desired outcome. And that gives you the action-outcome connection. Once you've mapped this out, then you have the framework to get human stakeholder alignment, to visualize all of the aspects in your decision model, and it creates the guardrails for machine learning to then run and create the prescriptive AI recommendations. So this is what it looks like in our product within Humana AI. Yeah, let's make sure Wi-Fi looks like it probably will work, so we can attempt to play the video. This is just an example of how our product works. You might build this a different way, but this is how we do it. We start with a blank canvas for a decision builder, and then you click to add nodes and build out the action intermediaries, external factors. So when you first collect a node, it might be something like this. You set your desired outcome. Let's say it's increasing revenue. This is a SaaS revenue model that's represented here. Then you click and add node and connect it, and it would be an intermediate, something like the number of deals that are closed won. If anybody's familiar with Salesforce or pipeline management software, closed won means you closed a deal. You're going to get paid for it. Upstream from that might be things like the amount you invest in paid media that leads to more closed won deals. Once you map out the whole thing, everything that you can do, then you get a complete decision model. You can connect your data sources, might be from the CRM or ERP system or some data warehouse like Snowflake or Databricks. And then decision makers on a day-to-day basis can look at the overall model and weigh out different decisions. Is it more effective to invest in paid media or to hire more salespeople who can make more calls? And the model will predict the likelihood of achieving your desired outcome. So you use this to map out long-term decisions, and then you can use it to check on a day-to-day basis if you're on track towards your goals. And the prescriptive AI will make recommendations that you might not have even thought of. Here's an action that you could take which would be even more impactful towards your desired goal. All right. That's the end of my long talk. Thanks for bearing with me for 15 minutes. Now I'd like to take a break, and then we'll get into the workshop. So we've made this causal decision diagram or causal decision map builder available. Everybody here can log in, use this URL. It's hosted on our GitHub. You can practice. You can actually try mapping out a decision using this framework. This is why you need a computer. So let's take about 5-minute break. Please, use the washroom if you'd like to, grab a drink. And importantly, get your computer, log on to the Wi-Fi, or find a friend who has a computer, and you can get hands-on trying to build one of these things. Thanks.
What is it called?
Where did you go last week?
To proceed with getting hands-on with this. I'm sorry for the long URL, but if you type this in, like you see on screen here, you can get to the builder. You might get a warning because it's not really a public website, so depending on your browser, it might ask you whether you really want to proceed or not. Just click OK. It's not a hacking website or anything like that. As you can see, it's just a GitHub page hosted website. So what you can do with this builder, I'll demonstrate in a moment how it works, but essentially set your desired outcome, intermediate factors, the actions you can take, the externals that will affect them. When you completely build out a model, it looks something like this. Here's an example of the revenue model that you saw in the demo, the YouTube demo. This is it built out within this builder. It's a free form builder, and so you can organize it whatever way is intuitive to you. I will, yeah. I was just explaining for a moment. I'll go back to the URL. So you'll get something like this, but don't worry about where you position items or where the elbow connectors overlap. It really doesn't matter how you structure it. You can structure it top down or bottom up or whatever is intuitive to you, and it will actually be interesting to see how people want to structure them. Going back to the example, we usually start with one outcome and then build it like this. I would recommend starting with that framework. And if you don't have a computer and you don't feel like making friends with somebody to use theirs, you could go back to the completely analog version of it and just map this out on a piece of paper. It's the same essential thought exercise, but I think building it with the builder, it gives some guidelines, it makes it a little bit more intuitive. Okay, so there's that URL. Jean Paul, if you could let me know when you entered that, if you get there okay. I'll come around and help people as you build up your models. So for this workshop portion, let's communicate with each other as much as possible and try to learn from each other how you actually use it. And most importantly, you have to decide what you're going to build. What kind of a decision do you want to try to solve with this builder? So for example, you could start with something relatively easy, something that's personal and close to you, something like, what career path should I map out from now? Maybe you've been inspired by this talk about the power of prescriptive AI using Python, and you decided that you'd like to upskill and become an expert developer in Python, because that will lead to your future career prospects. Well, that's a good example. But you have to start with a quantifiable metric. So your desired outcome, everything flows back from that. That's called your North Star metric. So your outcome is very important. You have to make that essentially a number, something quantifiable, as opposed to quants instead of qualitative metrics. Quantifiable metric is something that we usually think of in terms of KPIs. So I want to increase my salary by 20%. That would be what you would put in as your outcome. And your hypothesis, what you're modeling here, is something like, well, if I invest in learning Python and upskilling, I can get a better job as a developer, and that will allow me to increase my salary by 20%. So that's the specific model that you would invest in there. And then you might map out external factors that would affect that, like the number of Python developers in your geographic region that you have to compete with. Or you might map out as an external factor whether generative AI is going to make Python developers redundant or not. Personally, I don't think so. I think generative AI is a useful tool, but it's not going to take anybody's job. But you might map that out as a theoretical external factor. So if we get into mapping out externals, intermediates, and actions, a lot of questions will arise, and that's why we want to do this as an interactive workshop, and I do recommend doing it with somebody so that you can consult, or you can ask me, how do you actually build the models? If everybody's done with that URL, I'd like to show you a little bit about how the builder itself works. This is the builder live, so we can actually reposition different items, we can interact with them. This is how it works. When you set your desired outcome, you start with a blank canvas that looks like this screen here, or pretty similar to it. You click on the items in the left, something like outcome, and it'll just drop a purple outcome node onto the canvas. And you're totally free to position that anywhere you like. You can zoom in, with your mouse or trackpad, zoom in, zoom out. It's best to set a quantifiable metric to that desired outcome. So I'm going to name this. I'm going to say that our desired revenue uplift here is quantifiable as a 30% revenue. Submit. Now we have a number that the rest of the model will influence. And when we build the prescriptive AI model, everything will work backwards from that objective. It will tell us whether we're going upwards or downwards, respective to that goal. The things that are mapped out on this model are cost factors like employee training, employee retention, revenue contributing factors like number of leads that you can create, and the actions are things like how much paid media you invest in versus how much content you can create, or SEO that you invest in, assuming this is done, there's a cost associated with it that you're doing through an agency, or the amount of sales activities your team can do. Essentially, that is a hiring causal chain. In order to do a higher number of emails, you have to hire more people. In order to have your salespeople do more calls, you have to hire more people. Everything in this model assumes a good work-life balance. We're not overworking this. Because if we did, then we would get HR complaints and the cost factor would increase because we wouldn't be able to retain people. So the hiring causal chain would go up. All right, so I recommend that you choose something that's relatively simple and then practice trying to build that yourselves. The way it works in the builder, when you click on actions, it drops an action somewhere on the canvas. It sort of feels a little bit random. But then to connect that to an intermediate, it's like this. I'll zoom in a little bit here. Hover over the black dot, click, drag, and you've created a causal chain. Now, if you want to highlight a particular causal chain, this is kind of cool. You can click on that connector, and then Command 1, 2, 3 allows you to change the color. And that indicates whether you're getting uplift, downlift, or it's neutral in the overall causal chain. The way the model actually works on the front end, once the AI connected and everything is built, is that the causal chains that have uplift or downlift are automatically identified in red, or sorry, green for uplift, yellow for neutral, red for downlift. But you can practice modeling out there. Okay, enough of listening to me. I'm going to turn the mic off and just come around to you guys and try to help you build out models. Please think of what decision you want to build and go ahead and build it. Good luck.
Part of our thesis on the investor
This is actually a pretty good question. Okay, so just for the sake of the recording, so that anybody who watches this later can hear, this is actually a question, follow-up question to the VC ROI model, right?
So the question is, every time we invest in or build a company, the criteria is that the product or business must have a 10x ROI for our users. In other words, that's a combination of their revenue increases by 10x by using the product, or a mixture of time saved by using the product, time saved by X, or cost reduced by X. So altogether, it's a 10x ROI for our users, customers.
So going back to that ROI to VC model, we're using this as the reference, just for people on the recording. As you build up your model, what you've mapped out here is 10x ROI, right? You've got your time factors, so your T values, time saved by X amount, reduced costs by X amount. Those are great intermediates. Now, what you need to map out next is what's upstream from that. So what's going to affect time saved? What's going to affect costs reduced? Right? But time saved, these quantifiable metrics here, these are actually great concurrent outcomes. So in the model that you're building, it's not actually a single outcome model. You're probably looking at a multiple outcome model, right? So you probably want to move these purple intermediates over to here and have that, or sorry, blue intermediates to the purple outcome, and you're going to have a multi-outcome model, which is a great question because a lot of the time you do have multiple desired outcomes. No, there's two ways that you can model that. You can go with the pure intermediate metrics and measure them, measure the actions you can take that would affect those, and then just the 10x ROI, it's fine. Or you can say, okay, 10x ROI is one of our desired outcomes, And we also want save time, save cost, and it's fine to do it. I'm just going to say this for the record. Actions should start with a verb. That is kind of a good thought exercise. Every action that you put into your decision model, it's going to be do something. So in this action model, can I say it's going to be hire. Hire is your action. So it's going to be like hire or develop or build or reduce action. I think in this case, maybe hire more HR staff who can hire more people.
So either true or false. I think successful or
This is exactly what they want. It's like, sweet.
Sorry, one part of the builder that's maybe not that intuitive is how to delete one of the elbow connectors or causal lines. The delete button doesn't work in the builder right now. It's still in beta. So go to edit and then delete edge. Edge is what those connectors are called in this mix.
You know, yes, you're gonna look at me, it's stupid, you're using your tech, so go ahead. That's the problem with this. It's very difficult for people to support demand.
Right. For the purposes of the recording, I very much repeat the question. So, are we looking to map out every possible action that we can take, and then the AI will make the connections for us? No, the goal is more to have human judgment augmented by AI just at critical points. So this process of thinking through the decision model, creating the map, and then getting stakeholder alignment with your team about what actions to include and which actions not to include, that's like the memo washing process. That's still an analog process. And so it's a lot of thinking through, is this action meaningful? Should we include it in this decision model? Or should we put it into a different decision model?
On the whiteboard, you post it aloud and you brainstorm. Is it something like that that AI does? Or what do you call it? Is it, I said it and you didn't answer it. Is that you put A and B and AI will lay out everything for you automatically. It is not that, but it is more of brainstorming that and AI is helping the team to make decisions. Is that how it works?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. The answer is that using the builder to create the map is a human process. AI comes after you've built the model, where you've identified the actions that you can connect to data. So at this point, sorry, but no, you have to do that work yourself. AI is not going to do that part for you. This is really critical. This is how we get the AI augmented decision making instead of AI automated decision making. We don't want the AI choosing what the decision model is and what the actions are, because AI doesn't know what is the legislature, what are the legal rules for your business. AI is not going to know what are your internal processes. AI is not going to know what Tanaka-san's favorite project is. Yeah.
ChatGPT, you can upload a lot of files to make the AI learn from those files that are relevant to your business, and you can kind of make the AI learn, what the situation may be surrounding your business situation, whatever it is. Is it something like that, or is it you are in the process of going that way, or how is it now?
Yeah, that's also a really good follow-up question. So, to rephrase the question, can you leverage generative AI, large language models, natural language processing, or let's say OCR, character recognition, to take your internal processes, recognize what those are, and then process those into the decision map? Theoretically, yes, but I still recommend building the decision model together with your team. because it gets stakeholder alignment. You have to actually talk about the model with your stakeholders. And if you have, Tanaka-san wants this project, Suzuki-san wants this project, they have their budgets and they've kind of been disagreeing about it. Well, by building the map, you actually get clarity, and you might find that Suzuki-san's project isn't relevant to this decision model, and so it should go to a different model. Maybe Tanaka-san's project is relevant, and so it should go in this one. You have to go through that human alignment process in order to leverage human judgment, all of your internal procedures, all of the human knowledge. So this process should be human oriented. Yes, you can leverage AI, you can leverage technology, you can leverage data structuring programs, CRM, ERP, etc. So when it comes to internal procedures, for example, there are platforms that allow you to enter into a digital system, into a database, what all of your procedures are. And if those are properly tagged and it's structured data, you can pull that into the data warehouse, and then you can run the prescriptive AI on those models if they're structured correctly. But that's not the goal yet at this point. The goal at this point is to create that action outcome connection. So using the builder here, this is basically an analog process. Now, if you're a good developer in Python, if you're really good at using LLM, in theory, yeah, you could build that component. You could create a data structuring process, an algorithm that would weight different components in your decision-making process, and maybe it would help to build some of the model for you. But I think you might lose a little bit of the Nemobashi or stakeholder alignment process by doing that. And at least in the research that we've done so far, it indicates that there isn't very much upside to doing that. There's more upside to choosing the actions that you can take that are meaningful to the model, and then connecting the data sets that you have available through the data warehouse if you have them. Especially if it's like Databricks or Snowflake and the data's properly structured already, then you can relatively easily build models off of that. So you don't want to automate everything. We have key points. Here's a way to imagine it. Remember the original Star Wars movies? AI in the Star Wars world doesn't control everything. AI just runs helpful little assistants like R2-D2. So AI doesn't fly the spaceship. It just helps you navigate and maybe repair if you get zapped by blasters. I like that version of the future where AI is like an advanced tool. R2-D2, he can shut down, you can carry him on to the next adventure and then, restart him, and he can do something useful, but he can't have the adventure by himself. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Humans have to create the model. AI is the tool that helps at certain points. Yeah, that's a really good question. So, do actions always come at the start of the chain, or do they come intermediate? Yeah, absolutely. If there is an intermediate or intermediary that doesn't have an action upstream from it, that is an action. So sometimes you'll have actions that have a direct effect on the desired outcome. So that's just a simple action outcome, direct connection, no intermediaries. And then sometimes your actions will be only one intermediary away from the desired outcome. It would be something like, let's imagine a simple one. Well, let's keep it really simple. I want to hire a salesperson. And so my desired outcome is to increase the number of salespeople. And so I'm going to interview as many salespeople as I can and choose something. Pretty simple causal chain, right? Basically, you're going to do the interviews, and you're going to hire somebody. So your action is very close to the desired outcome. But in your overall business model, you might have multiple upstream actions that would also affect the desired outcome. Maybe in that version, it's something like, well, hiring is good, but how do I retain them? So I want my people to be happy so that they write good reviews so that we get more people applying to work.
I mean, maybe steering actions. Maybe you have one action in the beginning of the chain, then some intermediaries and maybe external factors, and then you could make some steering action.
Let's say the decision. Let's say the company is struggling with a decision about whether to release product X. Right. So wouldn't the box on the far right be release product X? Right. And then the other things are, well, how much, what's the cost of manufacturing the product, and the cost of promoting it, and then the engineering costs, and then supporting it once it's released, and so forth. And then, but at the end of the day, if all those things are favorable, then okay, release product.
That's exactly it. Yeah. So in that model, your desired outcome is it's very simple. You could say it's a quantifiable metric. It's released or not, yes or no, essentially binary. Everything that flows into that causal chain influences whether you're going to release the product or not. So yes, the answer to that is yes in that model. But I don't think I quite got your question. Can you rephrase it?
So as I see it now, it's like this decision and multiple decisions, maybe multiple actions, and they influence just a single decision, right?
Well, you can have, in this model, it's a single outcome model. Sometimes you would have multiple outcomes. So you might decide that you want to map all the causal chains for everything that these actions will affect. Whether you create that digital twin of the entire business or not, it comes down to how effective is creating that complete digital twin. Is it more effective to leverage simple definable actions and the experience that your team already has to kind of answer the rest of the model? Or are there so many unknowns? Is there, let's say, a lack of experience? Maybe you're so new in the business model that you need to model multiple different things for multiple different outcomes. Would hiring and retention have multiple different outcomes? In that case, yeah, it makes sense to have a multi-outcome model. It doesn't have to be just one.
I'm thinking about maybe a few steps, not just one set of actions and then an outcome, but something like PDCA cycles, maybe a couple of cycles. So you make some actions, you receive some feedback from and then you make some, I call it steering action, but we call it anything. So maybe it should be like linked, chained diagrams. How do you see it?
Yeah, good question. So basically you want to make each of your action points a lever that's constantly updated by the data. So that gets to the next step. After you've mapped out the decision model, then you want to connect data so that you can have either something like a 24-hour or an hourly sync of all the data systems that are running that model. The next step in this process is to connect the causality of the different actions across the entire system. So if the data syncs and it indicates that there's a high probability that hiring one salesperson will achieve your desired outcome in this model, and it gives you positive uplift towards the probability of that outcome, but the next day the data syncs and let's say an external factor indicates that your competitor just hired 10 salespeople, your one-person hire is no longer as likely to achieve your desired outcome because of that external factor. So now the model has to update and say, this desired outcome is no longer as likely, it's X percentage lower, and now you have to hire not one, now you have to hire 10 salespeople, 100, or whatever it is. Yeah, exactly. And so the model is designed to be living, essentially. That's where you have to harness the power of prescriptive AI, which leverages the different Python libraries to do randomization calculations. So you get into using Monte Carlo simulation, for example, where it's what are all the possible permutations of this model? What is the likelihood of this to affect X, Y, Z, everything that you can possibly map. Now, that sounds pretty daunting, but there are statistical calculation models within those Python libraries, like the Monte Carlo algorithm, that takes into consideration all the possible permutations. Monte Carlo is really interesting. Do you know where it comes from?
I'm asking not mostly about like implementation of probabilities, etc., but maybe to better see the bigger picture, because sometimes it's not just a single decision, it's like a chain of decisions.
Right.
And sometimes you can like see what will be your, usually you can't see what will be your next decision before you have some feedback on your first decision.
Right. Right. Okay, now I better understand your question about the iterative decision models. So it's kind of a two-part answer. One is that you want to build the data sets in the AI so that it can model different scenarios and give you recommendations within the model. But this second part of the question is, once you've learned from that initial model, it might be time to then build an iterative model using that PDCA cycle Kaizen process, which maybe drops the actions which actually aren't effective and focuses more on the ones that are. And that's also kind of the question of why would people continue to log in and use our platform every day? It's because they're going to keep learning and wanting to build more and more models so that they can keep using this, say, cognitive ability to simulate different scenarios and then model out the likely permutations of all these different scenarios. You don't want to get lost in constant simulation and modeling. You want to narrow down. That whole PDCA cycle should be a process of narrowing down what's actually most effective in measuring that. So as you iterate, you'll learn from that. You'll learn that in this model, that action wasn't that relevant. Or this external factor that we were worried about never actually affected us, let's drop it. So you create another version. One thing that we didn't get into here is how the versioning of the models works. As you make different changes, it graphs out the effectiveness of those models in time and creates a version, kind of like a timestamp of what that decision was and all the factors were at that time. And you can move back and forward in time through the models to revisit decisions and then track whether your decision making is trending better or not over time. Very good question. We're almost at time, actually. We need to start wrapping it up. So I'll come around and check everybody's decision models, see where everybody's at. Maybe before we do that, let's do a quick sort of general Q&A. Does anybody have any general questions?
At what price point or how you plan to sell it? Like, is it like a, or you, let's say you visit Nomura and or a VC firm and they have 20 users per user, or how much effective that decision model will become and based on that, or what is that?
Okay, that's a great question. How do we intend to sell it? So tonight's event is me trying to wear two hats, right? One is as co-founder and CRO of a startup that's leveraging this technology. The other is as an advocate of the technology, trying to give you, the methodology, the secret sauce, so that you can use that yourself. So part of the answer would be, well, how would you build software and how would you like to sell it? Which I'll ask you just to sort of spark ideation. But for us, specifically, what we're doing with Keymatic is a consumption-based pricing model. So because our cost is processing the data, we build an architecture that has a little bit of arbitrage when it comes to processing all the data. We use cloud software like Google Creates, like GCP. We use their AutoML layer and their feature store and multiple deployment layers, as well as the Python toolkits that we referenced earlier. And the simple cloud computing costs are considerable for active users that are modeling different iterations of their decisions. And so we feel that the most fair pricing is to simply pass on the consumption fee of that data to our end users. So you can envision, you might have a large company that only has one model. And so despite being a Fortune 500 company, maybe they only really care about one outcome and they're only modeling one thing, and the data to process it might not be that large. Their fee might be smaller than, say, a startup company that's building multiple models and processing a lot of data in order to model out all these different scenarios. Their usage fee might be higher. So it's not based on like seats, it's based on overall consumption. Done? How would you price it?
So when we look at this as a product, like so, like this is software, and you have given the software, and the usage. But one other way is like, so many times big companies will take this but don't know how to use it. They might ask you yourself, can you provide us model building service as well? So you might have some partners or train them and then give service as well as the software. That would be one way to look at it.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it allows me to answer from that position of kind of wearing both hats, because this is how we're building it and how I would recommend building it. If you're thinking about doing something similar. You're right, it requires a lot of hands-on consulting to learn the methodology, to build an effective model, to get that stakeholder alignment. So that basically describes a solution service. So a large part of what we're doing is teaching people the methodology. And then you have to help them structure their data. You have to help them to implement the data, to get it into our ecosystem so that we can then build the models and deploy them. So it's a very sort of consultative, heavy enterprise software that has a long implementation process and can have a fairly long sales cycle. So if you're thinking of building a company like this, I recommend that you build it to be B2B enterprise software at a price point that can cover a direct sales team, a direct implementation team, and you probably want to start out with solutions consulting and then eventually roll that into your subscription package if it's a SaaS model. That's what we're doing. Kind of the other follow-up to that is, if you want to become a decision intelligence solutions consultant, that's a good sort of bridge to our final slide here. As part of Decision Intelligence Japan and what we're doing at Kimaru AI, we are running workshops so that you can get accredited on decision intelligence. Our next workshop is going to be next week on Wednesday, August 28th. You can scan the QR code to sign up on Hulu. These are our deep dive paid workshops. We are running 3 levels: decision analyst, decision architect, and decision engineer. The goal is to accredit consultants who can work with our platform, but also are familiar with the methodology so that they can sell their own consulting services. And we're offering a LinkedIn certificate after completion of the program. Right now we're running the first level, which is the decision analyst level. So it goes into a deeper dive than these introductory workshops or these events that we're doing. And maybe that's a good note or bridging point to say that our next event like this will be here at Google Startups Campus next month on the 3rd Wednesday. So we're going to keep running these every month here at Google Startups Campus on the 3rd Wednesday of the month. And then the paid workshops are across the street at our office, just over there, at Sivan's Lab in Shibuya. And those are 5,000 yen per session. And at the end of it, you take the accreditation course on LinkedIn leadership. So great, thanks. That was a great question. Okay, and with that, we're at time. If you'd like to contact me to learn more, please do so. Please reach out on LinkedIn. Please feel free to sign up for our next workshops. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. Does anybody have any other questions? Yes?
It's probably related to QRBI. You showed a while ago that there was a screen that you can connect data, those CRMs, so they blah blah blah. Is it, if I am a user of that platform, is it my responsibility to sort of create models and sort of connect those to the map, and then, or there's some feature there that kind of understand the connected data, and then somehow understand the patterns there, and then connect that to the, you know, the text, the English text that are labeled in the notes.
Right. Okay, great question. And so to repeat that was about the Kimari AI platform itself. And so, yeah, the answer is that we built the platform so that it is multi-user compatible. So within your organization, if you just have managers, executives that want to model decisions on a day-to-day basis, they're going to click into the action nodes and move the levers to test different ideas, like hiring more people, or what happens if we move, you know, these trucks a little bit faster to this distribution unit. They're just moving the levers in the model. But if in your organization you have decision analysts or decision engineers who want to understand, essentially in what we would call glass box AI as opposed to black box AI, what data sources are being used and what algorithms are being used. If they want to dive down into those subsequent layers and see how the models are built, they can do so. And also, they can upload their own models and change the parameters within the platform. So it's, imagine kind of like a car. If you know a little bit about your car and it's running rough, if you open the hood, you can kind of look at it and see, okay, well maybe it's smoking, or it's on fire, or there's oil leaking out. That seems to be a problem. That level of diagnostic is possible at the first layer. If you're a good mechanic, you could go down into the subsequent layers and say, oh, okay, that spark plug needs replacing, and actually do that yourself. So it's an attempt to make the platform accessible to these different user levels. So, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, great. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. I know it's been a pretty long session on a rainy, stormy night. I hope it was a fairly good way to spend the time. I hope it was educational, and I hope that you're interested in learning more. If you are, please scan the QR code and sign up for our next workshop for the deeper dive, or you can come back here a month from now, 3rd Wednesday, and we'll be doing the next session in this series, Everybody Welcome series. Okay, thanks very much, everybody.